Europe, in the summer of 1914, looked modern and prosperous, its cities alive with energy, innovation, and a sense of progress. Cafes buzzed with conversation, trains sped across the countryside, and the arts flourished in grand theatres and galleries. But beneath the surface, old rivalries and new ambitions simmered, creating a tension that was almost palpable to those who paid close attention. The continent's great powers, Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, were locked in a tense competition for influence, resources, and prestige. Alliances split Europe into two armed camps, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. These alliances were meant to deter war, but instead they created a web of obligations and suspicion. These alliances, meant to keep peace, actually set a trap. Any small conflict could pull everyone in, turning a spark into a continent-wide inferno. Nationalism was on the rise. Children learned to glorify their nation and distrust others. In schools and newspapers, patriotism was celebrated, and foreign nations were often portrayed as threats. Newspapers stoked fear and hatred, while an arms race escalated tensions. Every new battleship or artillery piece was seen as a challenge to rivals. Germany built a massive navy to rival Britain. France extended military service, and every nation poured resources into their armies and navies, preparing for a conflict many hoped to avoid but secretly expected. Russia, too, expanded its army, determined not to be left behind in the race for military might. War was seen by many leaders as inevitable, even desirable, a way to settle scores and secure dominance, to prove their nation's strength on the world stage. Generals planned for a quick, decisive conflict, not realizing how fragile peace truly was, or how devastating a modern war could become. The continent became an armed camp, where every move was seen as a threat, and every border bristled with suspicion and weaponry. The belief that war could be controlled was a dangerous illusion, one that would soon be shattered. Europe's magnificent house stood on a foundation of sand, its stability more fragile than anyone dared admit. All it needed was a single decisive push, a moment that would set the entire continent tumbling into chaos. That push was about to come, and Europe would never be the same again. The spark that would ignite the world came not in a grand capital, but in Sarajevo, a tense and divided city in the Balkans, where empires and nationalities collided. Serbian nationalism simmered, threatening Austria-Hungary's fragile multi-ethnic empire and fueling unrest throughout the region. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo, a date loaded with meaning for Serbs, marking the anniversary of a historic defeat. A group of young Bosnian Serbs, inspired by nationalist fervor and backed by the secretive Black Hand organization, saw him as a symbol of foreign oppression and domination. After a failed bomb attempt earlier that morning, a fateful wrong turn brought the Archduke's open car directly before Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators. Princip seized his moment, firing 2 shots at close range, killing Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie instantly. The assassination sent shockwaves across Europe, stunning governments and citizens alike, but war was not yet inevitable. Royal assassinations had happened before in Europe's turbulent history. Many believed this crisis, too, could be contained with careful diplomacy. The world watched anxiously, waiting to see if reason and negotiation would prevail or if disaster would follow. Would Europe's leaders choose restraint, or would the tangled web of alliances and old rivalries pull them inexorably toward war? The powder keg had been lit, its fuse burning dangerously close, but the explosion that would engulf the continent was not yet certain. Across Europe, the fate of millions hung in the balance, as ordinary people waited in fear and hope for what would come next. The next moves by leaders and nations would decide everything, setting the course for peace, or for the most devastating war the world had ever seen. Vienna blamed Serbia and wanted to crush it, but feared Russian intervention. Austria-Hungary needed Germany's support to act. On July 5, 1914, Germany gave Austria-Hungary a blank check unconditional backing, even if it meant war with Russia. German leaders believed war was inevitable and preferred to fight now, before Russia grew stronger. They gambled that Russia would back down and Britain would stay neutral. This reckless promise emboldened Austria-Hungary to issue a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. The blank check shifted the crisis from regional to continental. Without it, Austria-Hungary might not have risked war. With it, the countdown to catastrophe began. The fuse was burning fast. The blank check turned a diplomatic crisis into a test of wills between alliances. German leaders, convinced they were encircled, pushed Austria-Hungary to act quickly. They wanted a swift victory over Serbia before Russia could mobilize. They misjudged Russia's resolve and Britain's intentions. Instead of urging caution, Germany bet on war. The brakes were off. The path to peace was abandoned. The gamble would prove disastrous for all. In July 1914, Austria-Hungary sent Serbia a humiliating ultimatum, demanding near-total submission and threatening dire consequences if refused. The ultimatum was designed to be almost impossible to accept in full, putting Serbia in an impossible position. Serbia, under immense pressure, accepted most of the demands, but could not allow foreign investigators on its soil, fearing a loss of sovereignty and national pride. Austria-Hungary, unsatisfied with Serbia's response, broke off diplomatic relations and declared war on July 28, setting the stage for a much larger conflict. Russia, determined to protect its Slavic ally, began mobilizing its vast armies to defend Serbia. In response, Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia, demanding it halt its mobilization. In 1914, mobilization was seen as an act of war. Once the wheels were set in motion, it couldn't be stopped. Trains filled with soldiers and the machinery of war began to turn. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France, and soon after invaded neutral Belgium, violating its borders to execute its military plans. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality and alarmed by German aggression, joined the conflict, bringing its empire into the war. The alliance system, meant to keep peace, instead worked as a trap, pulling nation after nation into the conflict rather than shielding them from war. Within days, Europe plunged into war. The dominoes had fallen, and the continent was swept up in a tide of violence and uncertainty. Millions of soldiers and civilians were swept up in the chaos, their lives forever changed by the outbreak of hostilities. The world would never be the same. Cities, landscapes, and societies would be transformed by the devastation to come. The war everyone feared and some even wanted had begun, igniting passions and anxieties across the globe. The cost would be unimaginable, with suffering and loss on a scale the world had never witnessed before. The world was at war, and nothing would ever be the same again. War was greeted with parades and patriotic songs, but the reality was brutal. Young men rushed to enlist, expecting glory and a quick victory. Instead, they found endless trenches, mud, and death. The Schlieffen Plan failed. The Western Front became a stalemate. Life in the trenches was misery, shelling, gas, machine guns, and constant fear. Battles like the Somme and Verdun meant mass slaughter for little gain. New weapons made killing efficient, and psychological trauma was rampant. Civilians suffered shortages, hunger, and loss. Women filled jobs left by men at the front. By 1918, millions were dead, and a generation was scarred. The choices of a few had brought ruin to millions. The war's legacy would haunt Europe for decades. The world had changed forever. World War I was not fate. It was the result of choices. Leaders gambled with peace, misjudged rivals, and let alliances dictate action. The blank check to Austria-Hungary was the fatal turning point. Once mobilizations began, diplomacy was powerless. The lesson of 1914 is clear. War is a choice, not an inevitability. Aggressive nationalism and miscalculation can unleash catastrophe. Even in crisis, there are always off-ramps, always choices. The cemeteries of Europe remind us of the cost of failure. Peace is fragile, and its preservation demands wisdom and restraint. The story of 1914 warns us, never forget the human cost of a fatal choice.